Sitting in front of you is a classroom of students with unique interests: art, video games, animals, or nature. They also have goals. They are future veterinarians, program designers, firefighters, or storm chasers. You will spend time at the beginning of every school year getting to know these students and building individual relationships with each of them. Some of these students may have a disability that requires modification to their environment. Whether it be autism, a visual impairment, ADHD, the use of a wheelchair, or something else, how do you respond? Do you focus on the disability so much so that the individual fades away? Or do you continue to have high expectations? How does the language you use reflect your thinking? People First language keeps the focus on the individual rather than the disability. It is putting the individual before their diagnosis. As said on the Disability is Natural website, our language shapes our attitudes. Our attitudes shape our language. They're intertwined. And our attitudes and language drive our actions. The goal of People First language is to eliminate language that can have negative social consequences. The value and the potential of an individual are not defined or limited by their disability. However, when we put the disability before the individual in our language, we do just that. So let's look at some specific changes that we should make to ensure the use of People First language. So many times I hear, as you are talking, teachers refer to SPED students, or at our school, categorical students. Instead of referring to the students in this way, we should talk about what the student receives. So he receives SPED services, or he is a student in a categorical classroom. We also then have the opposite side, the students without disabilities. We sometimes call them general education students or a normal student. Instead, we should just say that they are a student without disabilities. Sometimes we can group students into just a group based on their disability. So we will say the handicapped or the disabled. Again, we need to put the person first, saying people with disabilities. Other examples of language that we can correct includes she's autistic. Instead, we should say she has autism. Or she is learning disabled. Instead, saying she has a learning disability. Instead of he's crippled, say he has a physical disability. Notice in these we are not using the word is, rather we are using the word has. We are not equating the person with their disability, rather we're using has to discuss their diagnosis. Instead of a hearing impaired, or instead of suffers a hearing loss, we say a person who is hard of hearing. Instead of deaf or blind, we can say a person who is deaf, or a person who is blind or visually impaired. When speaking of a person who uses a device, instead of having the device control them, as in the case of saying wheelchair bound, we should always have the person controlling the device. So saying a person who uses a wheelchair. We also have where we can refer to people in a group, like we did above with the deaf and the blind example. You can also say an epileptic. Instead of doing that, we should say a person with epilepsy. Instead of developmentally delayed, a person who has a developmental delay. When we talk about students who are not able to speak, instead of saying she is nonverbal, we should say that she communicates with her eyes, or she communicates with her device, or whatever it might be. Also, we want to make sure that we are not focusing on what they can't do. So instead of he can't walk, we say what they use to help them be able to overcome that disability, such as he uses a power chair. Instead of handicapped parking or a handicapped bathroom, we should talk about an accessible parking or accessible bathroom. And instead of she has problems with or has special needs, we should say she needs or she uses. And instead of has overcome, like I said right above there, remember a person first language is a habit that we are not always into using. And so we have to work on breaking our own habits, myself included. So instead of saying that they have overcome something, we can say a person who is successful or productive. So instead of saying that she uses a power chair to overcome her disability. It's she uses a power chair to modify her environment. So, as you reflect on your own language choices, consider these questions to guide you. Did you put the person before the disability? Does the descriptor control the person, or does the person control this descriptor? For example, saying a person who uses a wheelchair keeps the person in control of the wheelchair, whereas wheelchair bound has the wheelchair confining the person, as we discussed earlier. Have you segregated a group of people based on their need? This happens when we say things like the blind, the deaf, or the autistic. Remember, as discussed, we will say a person who is blind or a person who has a hearing impairment. And did you use the word is instead of has? Is equates the individual to their disability versus has, which refers to their diagnosis. Remember, we should treat individuals with disabilities the same as any other person because they are people too, and we have more in common than things that separate us. To learn more about Person First Language, visit the following sites that were used in the making of this presentation: Disability is Natural, the CDC, Recreation Integration Victoria, and resources by Kathy Snow, including her article on People First Language.